Francesca Mattioli, and as said, I will present our article that is called Exploring Innovation in Teaching of Design. And I would say this is more of a meta-level analysis of how design teaching is evolving, also after, let's say, the post-pandemic. So I'm Francesca Mattioli. I'm PhD in design and assistant professor in the design department of Politecnico di Milano. And the other co-authors are Laura Cipriani, Andrea Manciaracina, and Andrea Taverna. And we gathered together in the first place as we are all passionate and also researching on teaching in design education and instruction in general in design education. And specifically, we gathered together in this project that is called Innovation in Design Teaching. That is a project that was founded by the Department of Design at Politecnico di Milano right after the COVID pandemic, in order to explore and understand and investigate on the evolution and innovation in our teaching. And the rationale to let's say, develop this research in the first place, to propose it, is that changes in design teaching might be relevant because, as most of us are experiences in formal education, also in higher education, there is a wide acknowledgement of the shift from an objectivist to a more constructivist view on learning. And in this scenario, of course, active learning and kind of student-centered instruction is becoming a crucial parameter also for innovating teaching. Moreover, in this context, taking also a constructivist, let's say, approach, the actions that teachers in this case undertake to develop new practices might be very relevant to understand the way instruction is evolving, becoming in a way action research, of course. The issue with action research and qualitative research in general is also the situatedness of such initiatives. And therefore, we focus mostly our research in our context. And why design education is particularly relevant? Because design education in its DNA, if we want, is characterized by project-based learning and learning by doing. And therefore, somehow, in itself, it reflects the constructive principles that are kind of informing, most of all in other disciplines, maybe at the moment, more, let's say, traditional kind of teaching. And design, it's already including these kind of approaches. Even though, let's say, a constructive approach is already there, also design education, of course, clearly is evolving and changing. And this is why it was deemed useful to try to understand and explore in a more systematic way how these changes are happening. Hence, the paper is aimed at exploring these changes and what we call experimental teaching practices. Because from experimentations, probably some innovation will come out. So some new practices will become established. So this is what we have done in our context. And the paper aims to understand the motivation behind these changes, but also identify the components that are evolving within these practices from teachers' accounts. And most and foremost, propose a methodology or a qualitative approach for mapping and investigation innovation in other learning ecosystems. So to kind of respond to this polyphonic construction, we have done this in design education, but of course, it's relevant to understand how education is evolving in general. And so, okay, a short overview on the research method. So we developed this survey that was on the background, and we distributed that to our community of teachers. So we are talking about more than 500 teachers. and asked them to tell us and describe their experimental teaching practices in the last few years. And these are the practices we collected. So we had 53 practices collected by around 40 teachers. And we developed these sheets that appeared on the slide. And we collected in this, through the surveys, the rationale behind the implementation of these new practices, the description of the practice, the way it was developed, tested, the results, and so on and so forth. Then, starting from this data we collected, we developed qualitative coding based on predefined categories that represents the components of innovation of teaching and instructional practices that we try to map from the accounts, so from the direct accounts of the teachers. And from the coding, we developed, this is one of the most important results, so this is why I'm showing this among others, we developed an understanding on how teachers describe their practices and how the components were relevant, but also interconnected within each other. As you can see from this picture, the activity. So when teachers told us about their practices, they were focusing very much on the activities and connect other components of teaching to this component that emerges very relevant in the way design teachers describe their teaching practices. So very briefly, an overview on the findings, a brief discussion. So what emerged as rationales for experimentation? So teachers told us that the rationale behind their implementation of new practices was pretty much related to foster active and student-centered approaches. So in line with this overall direction that education is taking toward more constructivist approaches, but also the development of competencies that are relevant in today for the professional field. And last but not least, respond to logistical and organizational needs that were pretty much related to the COVID pandemic and the shift, the very, very fast shift we had to do from 2020 on. And then about the changing components, as already said, what was mainly described are activities. So we found that activities and design teaching are very much central in the experimentation. So this was changed more than, for example, assessment strategies or the objectives behind learning. And also, this, in our interpretation, is reflecting this emphasis that in design education we have on learning by doing. So the activity, what students have to do, is pretty much central in what we are also experimenting with. Last but not least, let's say all these methods can be, of course, adopted and used in other contexts as much as expanded in our context as well. And what was an insight and also a finding that will kind of inform future researchers is that this visualization we developed can be used also to foster self-reflection and therefore support the development of a more action research culture and awareness from teacher sides.
And thank you very much for sharing. This is food for thought. This is what, as teachers, we should be doing very oftenly, and we don't. So thank you for sharing, Francesca. Actually, I was looking at your diagram and I was thinking, I'm also into design teaching, and I was really very into all that you were sharing, but I was thinking that yes, we are going very central, we are going very activity driven, but when you were coding these operational concepts of your research as you were observing this, one thing, mentioning a lot or seeing a lot of people mentioning that they are very activity centered, doesn't mean that is most probably the most pertinent aspect of what we are doing with them. It can be an extremely important strategic aspect to drive our learning, active learning, based on activities. But in the end of the day, the assessment, for example, that I might not be mentioning such a lot. So the pertinence factor of what I'm mentioning, I would say assessment in the end of the day is still the most important, because I have to be at a certain point sure that the competences, the background knowledge and the scientific knowledge, and even the attitudes of my students are into place. So that kind of counting occurrences of what our colleagues were mentioning in your study, did you at some point correlate them with pertinence? One thing is frequency, the other is pertinence of what they were mentioning. I wonder if you have anything to mention on that. If I got it right, okay, I might have got it wrong.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. I will be fast just to expand a bit. Of course, I had very short time to present it. And in a way, this graph I showed, it's more of our interpretation, of course, of the data. And our understanding is not that, okay, so we know that design teaching is pretty much centered on activity, so let's only concentrate on that. Not at all, but it's rather say, okay, but how might we support a more, let's say, holistic view on the practices that we are developing? Because of course, if you change an activity, assessment will change too, and maybe something else, right? Maybe you're changing the objectives. But our aim in the end is to develop tools for teachers to become more aware and more like researchers in their experimentations. So this was just let's say an overview on like how from scratch, without giving like them tools, how they describe their teachings, and this is the result. So in the paper, of course, you find more about that, but it was quite interesting because and later on we had other interviews that will be published in other publications where we use these components while interviewing the people. So trying to kind of support them in expressing the different points and how they relate to each other. So that's, let's say, the design insight we got from this study.